What you say out loud and to yourself does more than express emotion or thought. It literally changes the brain. Spoken words, when repeated with intention and emotional engagement, become input signals for neural activity. Every word you speak has the potential to influence the circuitry of your mind and body. This isn't a metaphor, it's biology. And it starts with how language interacts with the nervous system. When you speak a word, especially one tied to belief or identity, it activates multiple regions of the brain at once. The auditory cortex processes the sound. The motor cortex controls the mouth and voice. But more importantly, areas like the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and planning, and the limbic system, where emotion is processed, are also engaged. That means every time you say something like, "Everything is aligning in my favor," you're not just talking. You're programming. You're shaping the patterns that determine how you interpret the world, what you expect from it, and how you respond to it. Repetition is the key to embedding that programming. Neural pathways strengthen through use, a principle called Hebbian plasticity. Neurons that fire together wire together. So when you repeat a phrase 100 times, especially with focused attention and emotional tone, those neurons begin to link more strongly. The phrase becomes more than a thought. It becomes a reflex. And reflexes are fast, automatic, and powerful. But repetition alone isn't enough. Emotional engagement acts as an amplifier. When you feel something as you say it, the amygdala, your brain's emotional processor, tags the information as important. That tag increases the likelihood the brain will encode it into long-term memory and adapt behavior around it. You are more likely to believe what you say if it comes with emotion. And belief isn't passive. It changes what you notice, what you pursue, and how resilient you become when things don't go as planned. In this way, speech functions as a kind of behavioral primer. When your words suggest alignment, your actions start to reflect that assumption. Your brain begins to predict favorable outcomes, and your body responds with reduced anxiety, clearer focus, and increased motivation. This is how fate starts to shift. Because you're not just hoping things will work out, you're preparing your system to engage as if they already are. The consistent use of intentional language builds a cognitive scaffolding that influences everything from attention to perception to motor output. It becomes easier to make decisions, to move forward, and to resist self-sabotage. And over time, this alignment between language and action creates a feedback loop. Your brain sees progress, rewards you with dopamine, and reinforces the belief you're building. That loop becomes the engine behind aligned fate, not magic, but mechanism. Speak with purpose, speak with repetition, and speak with emotion. Because the words you use are the signals your brain uses to build your future. When you say a phrase 100 times, you are not just reinforcing a message, you are physically altering your brain's architecture. This is not motivational fluff. This is neuroplasticity in action. Repetition, especially when intentional and emotionally charged, engages the brain's mechanisms for learning, memory, and behavior change. It sets into motion a process where what you say repeatedly becomes what you believe. And what you believe determines how you act, how you perceive, and how your life begins to take shape. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to rewire itself in response to experience. Every time you engage in a repeated thought or behavior, you're shaping the strength and structure of your synaptic connections. Think of it like carving a groove into a piece of wood. One pass makes a faint line, 100 passes make a deep channel. The same thing happens in your nervous system. Say a phrase once and it's a whisper to your brain. Say it 100 times and it becomes a command. This is especially true when the phrase carries a belief, something like, everything is aligning in my favor, even what I don't yet understand. That kind of statement engages areas of the brain responsible for both executive function and emotional regulation. The prefrontal cortex, which governs planning and decision-making, starts to treat that phrase as a cognitive anchor. It begins to filter incoming information through that belief. You're not blindly convincing yourself of something. You're training your brain to prioritize information and experiences that align with that internal narrative. Simultaneously, the hippocampus, critical for memory formation, starts to log this repeated statement as a pattern. And patterns are what the brain uses to automate thought and behavior. Once embedded, the phrase becomes part of your default thinking. You don't have to try to believe it anymore. You simply do. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The more you repeat the phrase, the more your brain releases neuromodulators like dopamine and norepinephrine, especially if you bring emotional intensity into the process. These chemicals enhance synaptic plasticity. They make the brain more receptive to rewiring. So if you say the phrase 100 times while focusing deeply and connecting emotionally to the idea, you're not just repeating, you're chemically reinforcing. Over time, the belief doesn't just live in your mind, it becomes embedded in your cognitive framework. It starts to influence your micro decisions, your tone of voice, your posture, and even your interpretation of setbacks. You begin to act in alignment with the idea that things are unfolding in your favor, which ironically makes it more likely that they do. So when you speak a phrase 100 times, you are doing something profound. You're not relying on chance. You're engineering your belief system at the level of biology. And that belief system becomes the filter through which fate itself begins to organize. Not because the world changes instantly, but because you do. The phrase, everything is aligning in my favor, even what I don't yet understand, might seem simple on the surface, but it's engineered to engage both the conscious mind and the unconscious systems that shape behavior, emotion, and perception. When spoken repeatedly, it doesn't just sit at the level of positive thinking, it works its way into the neural pathways that govern how you respond to life, especially when things feel uncertain or out of control. Let's start with the conscious component. The first part of the phrase, everything is aligning in my favor, is a direct statement of orientation. It tells the conscious mind where to aim its attention. This part of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, is goal-oriented. It's constantly trying to assess threats, manage decisions, and plan for the future. When you tell it that everything is aligning, you give it a directive. Look for order, not chaos. Look for opportunity, not obstruction. Over time, this shifts your cognitive bias. Your attention begins to filter experiences through the lens of forward movement and possibility. You're no longer scanning for what's broken. You're scanning for what's working, even in difficult conditions. But the second part of the phrase is just as important, even what I don't yet understand. This activates a very different set of systems. It speaks directly to the unconscious mind, the deeper circuitry involved in fear regulation, trust, and long-term pattern recognition. Most people carry an underlying anxiety around the unknown. That anxiety comes from the limbic system, especially the amygdala, which flags ambiguity as potential danger. But when you speak this phrase, you're reconditioning that response. You're teaching your nervous system that uncertainty doesn't equal threat. It can actually be part of progress. This is powerful because the unconscious mind controls more than just instinctual reactions. It governs subtle micro decisions, gut feelings, and your body's physiological state. If your unconscious mind starts to believe that even what you don't yet understand might still be working in your favor, then you reduce anticipatory stress, increase resilience, and become more adaptive in the face of complexity. The phrase "in full" forms a bridge between these two domains, what you can control and what you can't. It tells your brain, focus on the good you can see and trust the process for what you can't yet comprehend. That's a psychological alignment that has massive implications for behavior. People who operate with this dual awareness are less reactive, more focused, and more likely to stay in motion even when the path isn't clear. And remember, the brain responds to repetition. Say this phrase enough times and both the conscious and unconscious systems begin to adapt. The words go from language to framework, from idea to instinct. You're not just saying it, you're becoming it. And when your entire nervous system starts to believe that everything is aligning, including the uncertain parts, your behavior shifts. You lean into difficulty with less fear. You make decisions with more confidence. And slowly, what was once just a phrase becomes the structure of your mindset and the filter through which fate starts to respond. When you repeat a phrase like "everything is aligning in my favor," even what I don't yet understand, consistently, especially with emotional focus, it's not just your thoughts that change, it's your brain. Specifically, two key regions begin to adapt in measurable ways: the prefrontal cortex and the insula. These areas are not just passive processors of language or emotion. They are central command centers that determine how you perceive reality and how your body responds to stress. Let's start with the prefrontal cortex. This is the region right behind your forehead, and it plays a massive role in planning, decision-making, and top-down control of attention. When you speak intentional phrases over and over again, you engage this part of the brain in a unique way. The prefrontal cortex begins to link the words you're saying with your internal narrative, your sense of self, your expectations, and your sense of possibility. It essentially uses repetition as a signal. This must be important. Let's build a framework around it. Over time, it starts to prioritize information that aligns with the belief you're speaking. That means you begin to notice patterns that support alignment, progress, and trust. Even in moments where things seem unclear, you become less reactive and more intentional. That shift in perception isn't imagined. It's structured into your neural circuitry. Now let's look at the insula. The insula is tucked deeper inside the brain and is responsible for interoception, the awareness of internal states. It monitors your heartbeat, your breath, your gut feelings, and your overall sense of emotional tone. When you repeat a phrase that implies safety, trust, or alignment, especially when spoken with conviction, the insula takes note. It starts to recalibrate your internal baseline. This is where the stress response begins to change. Normally, uncertainty or challenge triggers an increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, your fight or flight response. But when the insula begins to receive repeated, consistent input that everything, even the unknown, is aligning in your favor, it downregulates that reactivity. Your brain interprets the phrase not just as information, but as instruction. We're safe, we're okay, we can move forward. That reduces anxiety, lowers cortisol, and allows more cognitive resources to be directed toward solution building instead of survival mode thinking. Together, the prefrontal cortex and insula create a loop. What you say alters your perception, and what you perceive alters your physiology. The more you repeat the phrase, the more that loop reinforces itself. You start to expect alignment. You begin to experience life through a lens of forward movement rather than hesitation or fear. Your stress response becomes more flexible, more adaptive. You stay clear-headed under pressure. You take more deliberate action. This is the biology of belief in motion, not just hope or positive thinking, but the real-time restructuring of the systems that govern how you think, feel, and act. So when you commit to speaking this phrase 100 times, you're not just talking. You're activating a high-level protocol in the brain that rewires both how you see the world and how your body responds to it. That's the foundation of alignment and the biology of fate turning in your favor. When you speak a phrase like, everything is aligning in my favor, even what I don't yet understand repeatedly, you're doing far more than creating a mental habit. You're influencing your brain's chemistry in a very specific, measurable way. The act of repetition, especially when paired with emotional intensity and focused attention, triggers a cascade of neurochemical shifts. One of the most powerful of these is the release of dopamine. Dopamine is not just the feel-good molecule. It's the molecule of motivation, reinforcement, and future-directed action. It plays a central role in how you learn, how you pursue goals, and how you respond to challenge. When you speak a phrase that signals progress, belief, or alignment, even if the external circumstances haven't changed, your brain interprets that as a cue. Something good is happening or is about to happen. And in response, dopamine is released. What makes this so powerful is that dopamine doesn't just make you feel better in the moment, it also strengthens the neural pathways associated with the behavior or thought pattern that triggered it. So if you say this phrase 100 times with conviction, you are literally reinforcing the belief behind the words. The brain says, this must be important. Let's encode this. You start to unconsciously expect favorable outcomes. You begin to act in ways that are congruent with that expectation. This isn't magical thinking, it's chemical conditioning. There's another layer to this. Dopamine enhances plasticity. That means it makes your brain more capable of rewiring itself. The repeated release of dopamine as you speak this phrase helps embed it more deeply, more quickly. And it's not just about thought, it's about behavior. Dopamine biases you toward action. When your system starts associating this phrase with a reward signal, you become more likely to take steps in the direction of that alignment. You don't just wait for fate to turn, you start turning it with your choices because you believe progress is possible, even inevitable. Also important, dopamine interacts with the brain's stress systems. When dopamine levels rise, it buffers against the negative effects of cortisol, the primary stress hormone. That's crucial because when you start to believe things are aligning, even the unknowns, you reduce perceived threat. That shift in internal chemistry creates a more balanced state, one that supports clarity, decision-making, and follow-through. This process creates a powerful feedback loop. You speak the phrase, dopamine is released. That reinforces the phrase neurologically. You begin to see small confirmations in your life, which reinforces the belief further. More dopamine is released, and on it goes. Eventually, your brain becomes a system biased toward favorable perception, empowered action, and internal motivation, all of which are essential for sustained change. So yes, repetition matters. But repetition alone isn't enough. What matters is that the words you speak are connected to a belief that's emotionally engaging and biologically rewarding. When they are, the brain responds with dopamine. And dopamine is the key that unlocks the transformation of thought into reality. When you repeat a phrase like, everything is aligning in my favor, even what I don't yet understand, consistently, you are doing more than speaking a positive affirmation. You are aligning two powerful forces, your internal neurobiology and your external behavior. This alignment isn't just philosophical, it's physiological. The brain and body begin to synchronize in a way that makes favorable outcomes more likely. Not because of luck, but because of structure. Because of systems, because you're training your biology to support your behavior, and that's what most people refer to as fate. Let's break it down. Every time you speak a phrase with intention, your brain registers it as a signal. Do it once and it's a brief pulse. Do it consistently and it becomes a pattern. That pattern begins to shape internal states, how you feel emotionally, how focused you are, how regulated your stress response becomes. Consistent repetition builds a reliable baseline in the nervous system. Over time, your internal state stabilizes around that message: certainty over doubt, calm over panic, direction over hesitation. Once that internal state is stabilized, your external behavior changes. You don't need to hype yourself up to take action. You're already primed. You don't need to convince yourself to stay calm under pressure. Your nervous system is already wired for it. This is where biology supports behavior. And behavior, over time, is what constructs reality. Here's how it works in the brain. Verbal repetition activates the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for focus and planning. That's your internal executive. At the same time, it communicates with deeper structures, like the limbic system, that regulate fear and motivation. When you say something over and over again, especially with emotional intensity, you create coherence across these systems. The higher order brain signals what it wants. The emotional brain adapts to support it. That coherence is critical. It creates neural efficiency, less internal conflict, more forward motion. Now add in behavior. When your thoughts are aligned with your emotional tone, your actions naturally follow. You reach out. You take initiative. You persist. These aren't random behaviors. They're the outward signs of a nervous system that's trained to expect alignment and act on it. Over time, those behaviors produce results. You start seeing things shift, not because circumstances suddenly became easier, but because your internal system stopped working against itself. This is why repetition matters. It's not just the words. It's the signal repetition sends to the body. This is our orientation now. You begin to trust the process, act with less friction, and remain emotionally regulated even when outcomes are uncertain. That creates a powerful loop. Internal clarity drives external action, and external progress reinforces internal belief. What most people call fate often starts here, not as something random, but is the cumulative result of aligned biology and repeated behavior. When you speak the right words consistently and intentionally, you are not just influencing your thoughts, you are engineering your nervous system to move in rhythm with the future you're building. That's alignment. And that's how fate begins to follow you. So understand this, your words are not just sounds, they're neural commands. When spoken with repetition, emotion, and intent, they reshape your brain, regulate your physiology, and redirect your behavior, saying, everything is aligning in my favor, even what I don't yet understand, isn't wishful thinking. It's a protocol, a system, a biologically supported mechanism for alignment. You are training perception, rewiring stress response, reinforcing belief through dopamine, and building neural circuitry that supports momentum over fear. Speak it 100 times a day, not for magic, but for mechanism. Not to hope for alignment, but to become aligned. Because when internal systems shift, external outcomes follow. This is where fate stops being accidental and starts becoming earned.